Hi, David.
Good morning, Bob. Greetings from Prince Edward County, Ontario.
Good to have you here, and greetings from Princeton, New Jersey. We have some thunder and rain here, so if people hear that, it doesn't mean that actual war has broken out between you and me, although we do disagree about the issue we're going to talk about, the Iran deal. Let me introduce us before we get into that. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. This is The Wright Show. You are David Frum, well-known public intellectual, senior editor at The Atlantic, author of a number of books. Want to mention one?
Most recently, Why Romney Lost, which was published 36 hours after the 2012 election.
Wow. Congratulations on that turnaround.
Miracle of ebooks.
Yeah. So we also may have barking dogs intermittently in terms of atmospherics, but we'll see. Now, I think it is safe to say that you are not in favor of the Iran nuclear deal that was recently announced, and that I am. Would you like to start by complaining about it, David?
Yeah. I want to make clear that I approved of the administration's effort to negotiate an outcome here. The military situation with Iran would have been very difficult and to be avoided if at all remotely possible. And I think seeking the thing that we are sometimes told this agreement was about, seeking a negotiated outcome and making the nuclear issue the paramount priority. I think those were good decisions. I think the administration negotiated in a way where they made it very clear they wanted the deal way too much, and where during the process of negotiation they took instrumentalities of pressure off the table. They made it very clear they wanted no additional sanctions during the course of the negotiation. And the result is that we have a deal whose arms control provisions are weak, and whose ancillary benefits to Iran are enormous and dangerous, including the flow of huge amounts of cash immediately into Iran at the same time as the conventional arms embargo comes off in fairly short order, and even the ballistic missile technology embargo comes off, within the very next few years.
Okay, let's take these one at a time. And of course, from Iran's point of view, it's money. It's not like we're giving it money. It's money of Iran's had been frozen, and then sanctions that have been imposed that are being...
I'm not here to worry about Iran's point of view. I'm here to worry about the American...
Right. Yeah, and I actually will, since we are talking about a negotiation. I think it is important to understand what Iran's point of view is. So I may be doing a little of that. I think if you don't understand the point of view of the person you're negotiating with, you can sometimes wind up with no deal at all when a deal could have been had. But in any event, let's talk about the arms control provisions that you don't like. I mean, there are kind of two issues. There's how long does this stuff last? So for 15 years, I mean, Iran is surrendering 98% of their enriched uranium, and they cannot enrich it for 15 years. That will be the situation. They will not be allowed to enrich it beyond 4%, which is nowhere near weapons grade. Very intrusive monitoring seems to be able to ensure that that's the case. Some provisions go longer, for 25 years. We will be monitoring their uranium mines, and you need uranium to build a bomb unless you are doing plutonium, and there's a separate part of it that precludes the plutonium path for, I think, 15 years. After 10 years, they can start... I mean, they're also losing... most of their centrifuges. Now we get technical. After 10 years, they can start increasing the number of centrifuges. As for at what point that might become significant, sometime between 10 and 15 years. So it's pretty complicated. But is your main complaint that this stuff doesn't last longer, or is it more about the intrusiveness of the inspections that will ensure compliance with what there is of the deal?
What does the administration say this deal will do? Assuming no Iranian cheating, and that's a heroic assumption, but assuming no Iranian cheating.
Well, it's not really an assumption. There is intrusive monitoring, and we can get to that, but go ahead.
Assuming no Iranian cheating, according to the administration itself, this deal for the next 8 years will extend the breakout time of an Iranian nuclear bomb from the current 2 to 3 months, the administration says, to perhaps 12 months. So we've gained 8-9 months of immunity from an Iranian breakout for a period of a little over 8 years. And in exchange for that, we are releasing to them $150 billion of cash. We are ending the arms embargoes, and we are bringing the regime into the community of nations and legitimating it and forswearing the most effective sanctions that the United States can impose for anything else terrible that they might do in the future, and they have a long history of doing terrible things. So that what we're buying, all the technical measures that you describe, all together add up to, you're buying an 8-month extension on their nuclear dangerousness for a period of about 8 years.
Well, I mean, first of all, for a long time, people who have said we have to do something about Iran, including Bibi Netanyahu, who was a big actor in this whole political drama, have been saying there's a huge difference between like a breakout time of 1 or 2 months and maybe a year. That but because in their view, a year gives you time to respond to any movement toward a bomb. I actually think you don't need that long. But anyway, people have been talking as if that's a big deal. In any event, I mean, there's a premise underlying. I mean, you can always ask for a better deal. You can always wish you had a better deal. Every car I've ever bought, I wish I'd paid less. The dealer wish I'd paid more. So it can't be the case that your criterion for a bad deal is one where you wish you had gotten a better deal. You have to look at what leverage you actually had. And here I think, and what alternatives the other side had. And here I think people in general are not really looking at what leverage we did and did not have. So what could we have done as an alternative to this deal in terms of continuing to coerce Iran to comply with our wishes, in your view? What was the leverage?
Over the course of 2012 and 2013, American and global economic sanctions sent the Iranian economy into a profound crisis. The currency lost 3/4 of its value in a few months. Inflation accelerated. Unemployment went up. Basic goods vanished from stores. By the way, these are sanctions that were imposed in January 2012 over the Obama administration's objections. The Obama administration now takes credit for these sanctions. But at the time, according to their authors, Senators Kirk and Menendez, the Obama administration fought them tooth and nail. They opposed the sanctions. Sanctions were put in place, and the Iranian economy went into freefall. That is before the recent declines in the price of oil, which only increased the threat to the Iranian economy. That's before ISIS materialized in an effective way on Iran's borders to increase the security crisis the Iran faced. One of the things that when the administration says it's this deal or war, the embedded premise there is we got the best deal we could. But to use your car analogy, they didn't act like people who were determined to get the best deal. When you walk into the dealership and say, I must have that car, and when you say my choice is that car or walking up I-95, and anytime that the partner says to you, maybe we should shop elsewhere, you say, shh, I'm handling this. I've got this. Let me talk to the salesman. He's my friend. You're probably not going to do well. So when we examine the process, we can see this is not the process that you get when you're shopping most shrewdly. And we had the instrumentality of ever intensifying economic pressure on a regime that, but for the way the Obama administration did these negotiations, would be in more economic trouble today, even than it was in 2012 and 13.
Well, yeah, I know. I gather you think we should have sent signals more successfully that seemed to evince, kind of standoffishness, and not sent Kerry there.
When the Iranians balked, Eli Lake, who you often talk to, has chronicled how much this deal deteriorated just since April of this year. That the final agreement departs in very significant ways, almost all of them to America's detriment, from the statement that was released on April 2nd. Yet during that period, the administration the members of Congress have said, why don't we pass some standby sanctions and just show the Iranians what might happen to them if they continue to balk? The administration said, no, we believe that anything threatening will make things worse. Well, that clearly turned out to be wrong, because the deal that we have in July is worse than the framework that was published in April.
Actually, that's not true. And I don't buy Eli's analysis. I've looked at some of his bullet points, but a perfect example. There are a couple of examples. I mean, first of all, your general claim that we backed off on everything because it was so clear we wanted a deal. Khomeini came out and said, under no circumstances will they ever inspect military facilities. We now know that the deal does leave open quite pointedly the possibility of inspecting military facilities under the additional protocol. Secondly, if you say
subject to Iranian approval.
Yeah, there's a process of approval, but it's actually loaded in our favor. It can take like 20 days to play out, but it's actually loaded in our favor. If you look at the mechanics of it now, as for backing off the so-called JPOA of a couple of years ago, actually,
I'm talking about the framework of just April of this year. The statement when they got to the final deal, and they published, the administration published in April a series of talking.
Well, there was no published deal then. The two sides gave conflicting accounts of what had been agreed. There was a statement. The only published consensus statement was a statement delivered by the EU and Iran collectively, and we did not back off from anything in that.
No, now, as for the White House published a statement in April of this year,
and it conflicted with what Iran published. Yes.
Right, and so whose version prevailed? The Iranian provision, not the American provision.
Well, but first of all, the White House's provision actually differed from the original JPOA, which was a written agreement between Iran and the negotiating powers. Said, for example, this envisions the comprehensive lifting of UN sanctions related to the nuclear issue that manifestly and explicitly included the arms sanctions against Iran. But then later, we said, no, wait a second. Partly under domestic political pressure. No, wait a second. The arms sanctions are different. They're not in this. The JPOA had said they will be lifted. We said no, and we wound up negotiating a compromise where they are not going to be lifted for 5 to 8 years. That was a movement in our favor from the initial JPOA. The military facility, there are a lot of examples where they wound up giving ground. And both sides gave ground, and that's the way negotiations work.
Not to bog us down in technicalities, but Iran is subject to sanctions both for its nuclear activities and for its ballistic missile activities and for its terrorist activities. And what the administration decided to do, as in their process of yielding, was a lot of things that were originally imposed to punish Iran for ballistic missile activities. The administration then said, those things that relate to their ballistic missile activities we're going to put into the nuclear box. So, but back when the original framework, when the process was started, nobody contemplated that we're going to lift sanctions because of their terrorism or nuclear or ballistic missile activities, and now they're getting relief.
No, the UN sanctions on arms explicitly tie that sanction to the nuclear issue. It's in the resolutions.
The American sanctions that are going to be lifted pertain to their ballistic nuclear program.
Well, and those also give the president the right to lift the sanctions, and Congress gave him that right. But there's a larger thing here. The assumption that we had kind of infinite leverage and could have kept the sanctions regime intact, I think, runs into two problems, and let me spell them out. One is kind of a legalistic problem. Now, there are three kinds of sanctions: U.S. unilateral sanctions, EU sanctions, UN sanctions. And they're all important collectively in terms of the pressure that's brought to bear. The explicit basis for the UN sanctions, and I think the EU sanctions, certainly the UN sanctions, is that Iran was in violation of international law. Now, how was Iran in violation of international law? It violated its obligation under the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it was in violation of international law. But one thing about the NPT is it lets you leave it with 6 months' notice. So at any point, Iran could have said, we're leaving the NPT. Once they're out of it, they can build a nuclear bomb, and then they have the exact status in international law of Israel, India, Pakistan. We don't sanction Israel for developing nuclear weapons because they have the right under international law so long as they're not in the NPT. So Iran had the option at any point of changing their status in international law, totally undermining the basis for the UN sanctions. Now, separate from that, and I think the EU sanctions, separate from that, there's a pragmatic problem with maintaining the sanctions, which is if we had walked away from a deal that all our partners, Germany, England, France, Russia, China, said was a good deal, then I think pretty much everyone who's paying attention believes that what would have happened is that as a practical matter, leaving the legalities aside, the sanctions would have unraveled. They were already showing signs of unraveling. Then in the end, we'd be left with a situation where the U.S. can keep imposing sanctions and just entirely bear the burden itself while European companies get rich and so on. The sanctions were going to unravel as a practical matter.
Bob, this is a rationalization, not a reason. The sanctions that brought Iran to the table were the Kirk-Menendez sanctions of January 2012. And those were U.S. unilateral sanctions that locked Iran out of the international payment system. All those other sanctions which had been in place before January of 2012 had not succeeded. They did not have much bite. And Iran got around them in many, many ways. The sanctions that bit were U.S. sanctions only, and the administration now, confronting a deal with a lot of criticism, is saying, well, we had no choice. The clock was ticking. We were running out of time. If we didn't hurry this thing along, the whole regime would have collapsed. But that is something they're saying after the fact. I don't think anybody in 5 months ago, 8 months ago would have said, oh my gosh, the sanctions regime on Iran is unraveling. And especially not at a time when the Iranian currency was collapsing. We had those, and we are, by the way, and we're now going to give up the ability ever to reimpose those sanctions, isolating Iran from the international payment system.
Well, unilaterally, I mean, as a matter of fact, if the U.S. under a future Republican president and Republican Congress reimposes sanctions, those sanctions will have been reimposed. It may be some kind of technical violation of what we're saying now, but that actually is, as a matter of fact, an option. As for what brought Iran to the table, I don't think it's just the American sanctions. And in fact, well before 2012, Iran was negotiating seriously, and much of this deal was actually on the table. And at one point, there were signs of real progress, and then it got caught up in Iranian politics and so on. But they were focused on relieving sanctions long before the sanctions of 2012. And so, you know,
that's why the negotiation. I agree with that, and that's why I believe in the negotiation. But I think let me just give you one example of a terrible negotiating practice, and I think even you, with your sympathy for it, will agree to this. You don't send a secretary of state to negotiate an agreement because the Secretary of State is inherently part of the committee of principals who will review the agreement. They'll be on the phone with the folks back home, and they'll be saying, "Here's what happened today," and the Secretary of State should be part of the team that says this is acceptable, this is not. Once you make the Secretary of State a negotiator, you bias your whole review process in favor of approving what the negotiating team is doing. It just seems to be an obvious error to do that. And why was it done? Why was John Kerry there?
So they shouldn't have sent their Secretary of State either under that scenario, but they did.
First, if they want to send their foreign minister, that's
right.
Their lookout, because although in theoretical protocol terms, an Iranian foreign minister is equal to an American Secretary of State, in no real-world power equation is an Iranian foreign minister equivalent to a U.S. Secretary of State, especially one who is the presidential nominee of his party. So they can send who they want, but the United States should have had a plenipotentiary who is disavowable. In the Iranian system, even though in protocol terms the foreign minister is equal to the Secretary of State, he is disavowable because the supreme authority of the Iranian state, he's not appointed by the supreme authority of the Iranian state. He doesn't answer strictly to him. The Iranians sent somebody who was disavowable. The United States sent somebody who was not disavowable. And that's a bad practice.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can argue that. There's an argument on the other side, which is that in terms of Iranian domestic politics, if they're going to sell this to their hardliners, we have to show them signs of respect, which includes the Secretary of State. You can argue it either way, but I mean, who knows? I think we should focus on the actual material facts of the deal, what we wound up with, how easy it would have been to get something better, how effective it is. It has an extremely intrusive inspection regime. I'm not aware, maybe you are, of a negotiated arms accord in the entire history of humankind that has an inspections regime as comprehensive and intrusive as this. If you're aware of one, let me know. But I think this broke new ground.
Except it relies very heavily on technical means. Inspectors, and these are the things that are familiar.
Like cameras in their facilities, yeah.
There are cameras in the North Korean facilities too. There's 24 days in which they have to clean up sites. Or actually more if they play their cards right. And the reimposition of sanctions is going to be, should they be caught cheating, is going to be difficult, especially given the mode in which they cheat. Mark Dubowitz makes, I believe you talked to him on this air.
Actually, I've successfully avoided that, but I'd be happy to.
Well, he's the leading, most knowledgeable person. I don't know why you'd want to avoid talking to him.
No, I'm happy to. Tell him to email me. I'm ready.
But Mark makes this point. Iranians don't cheat egregiously. They cheat incrementally with a cumulative egregious effect. But each step is something that is relatively minor, something that can be explained away by people who are minded to explain it away. And we're going to be confronted now over the years with a series of accumulating problems that steadily accelerate the Iranian bomb, but that are going to be, we have to get other countries to go along with any reimposition of these so-called snapback sanctions.
But I thought you said they didn't matter anyway, and all that matters is the U.S. sanctions.
No, but the U.S. sanctions the U.S. sanctions have been folded in order to reimpose.
Yeah, but a future Republican president, Republican Congress can do whatever they want.
A future president may be able to do some things, but if we are going to, we can look. And the president of the United States always has the Pearl Harbor option of out of a clear blue yonder blowing up the Iranian facilities. I don't think that's going to happen. The question is if we are going to make a negotiated outcome work, and that's what I want to do. I'm not trying to blow up a negotiated outcome. I'm trying to get us to one that actually achieves what the president said he was intending to do, which is to stop, not just delay this program. In order to enforce this agreement, we're going to have other countries go along, and we have set up a detection process that makes that very difficult, knowing our customer, knowing that they are incremental, not egregious cheaters.
Well, again, I don't know how deep people want to get into the details, but all of the facilities where stuff is currently going on are comprehensively monitored 24/7. We'll know exactly what happens there. The heavy water reactor, which represents the plutonium path to getting a bomb as opposed to the uranium path, is being verifiably re-engineered to make that impossible. So then the question becomes, well, but what if they set up some secret facility somewhere and try to do something there? Well, again, this is the only place where the so-called 24-day delay enters in. First of all, amazingly, we have the right to inspect any place, including the military facilities that only weeks ago Khamenei said he'd never let us inspect. Yes, the process could take 24 days for this process that is, again, I said, is stacked in our favor in terms of the panels that review it and so on to unfold. But again, this is, and meanwhile, by the way, we are monitoring all their uranium mines. Well, if they can't do it with plutonium, and we know exactly how much uranium is coming out of their mines, then even if they're developing a secret facility, it's really not clear what they're going to be doing there, because you got to have either plutonium or uranium. The monitoring of the uranium mines goes on for 25 years. So, again, and you can say, well, there is this process of 24 days. If it were a dinky facility and they hadn't really started processing uranium yet, maybe they could conceal it in that time. Maybe, but again, if they're doing anything substantial, that's not going to be the case. And in any event, this breaks new ground in terms of the overall comprehensiveness and intrusiveness of the regime in the entire history of humankind. And name another nation that's willing to put up with this, another nation in the region, or the United States. We're all parties of the NPT, but we're not,
One of the things I really don't like about the way some of this discussion gets framed is, the Japanese would never submit to this. The Japanese are not a threat to international peace and security. The Japanese did not try to carry out an assassination attempt on American soil as recently as when was the attempt on the life of the Saudi ambassador? The Japanese are not holding American hostages as we speak. And Iran is a unique international rule breaker and a unique international rogue state designated by the United States for decades as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. We don't treat them like the way we treat the Japanese or German or even Brazilian nuclear program that we have. One of the things that is sort of weird about a lot of the advocate discussions, it's the whole idea that we have to act like we are the judge in our own case. And, well, are our standards fair? Are we treating all the 190 plus nations of the world equally? The United States is an actor. It's not a judge. It is entitled to advance its own interests, and its interests include making sure that a uniquely dangerous and destabilizing and norm-violating state does not get terrible weapons and the means to deliver them.
Yeah, but, first of all, I'd say, yes, we are an actor in this, but I think you'd agree that just as when I conduct myself in society, I try to ensure that the rules I expect other people to abide by are the rules I would expect myself to abide by and my friends to abide by, right? So I think if you're complaining about me doing that thought experiment, I'm afraid I have to resist. I think it's legitimate.
Okay.
But on the specific, let me address the specifics of what you're talking about. You're saying, well, Iran is this uniquely nefarious or uniquely threatening country. Well, first of all, if you want to, we could have a separate argument about whether Iran or Saudi Arabia is doing more to destabilize the Middle East. I think Saudi Arabia, our ally, is. Or if you want to talk about who the most egregious human rights violators are in the region, I don't think it's Iran. And you brought up specifically the case as a kind of smoking gun of them sponsoring an assassination on foreign soil. I think we actually still don't know the details of the case you brought up. What we do know, apparently, thanks to WikiLeaks, is, or maybe it's the Snowden papers, it was reported last week, Israel assassinated a Syrian general on Syrian soil. I think you would also agree with me that in all probability it's Israel that assassinated the Iranian nuclear scientists over the last couple of years. So that's 2 acts of war right there. So if you really believe that assassinating people on foreign soil, it puts you in a special category and there should be sanctions and so on, then you should favor them against Israel, right?
Syria has been in a constant state of war with Israel since 1948. That they are.
Well, they got a funny way of showing it. There hasn't been much violence, but go ahead.
No, but the question is, when you say we're now down to the is it okay to assassinate Admiral Yamamoto question. The United States shot down the plane of the author of the Pearl Harbor attack during the middle of World War II.
Well, that was a true war, but yeah.
But look, Syria continues to sponsor terrorism against Israel, and it's never suspended the state of war despite being asked to again and again. So they don't have a lot of basis to complain.
And what about the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientists? So far as we know, we're not even engaged in weapons research. Not that would have been grounds for killing them anyway. But,
I don't know that. I'm sorry.
What about that?
I don't know that Israel did that. There are a lot of.
Come on, David.
No, there are a lot of people who have a reason to do that, from Kurds to interior opponents.
Yeah, but the rest of them would have failed.
To the United States itself, to Britain. There are a lot of people who could have done that.
You think Britain did it? You think Britain did it?
If I had to guess, I would think there is a considerable degree of inter-allied cooperation, and that the actual assassination was probably done.
Well, I'm ashamed to say that we may have been complicit in that, but I think almost no one doubts that Israel played the lead role.
I would guess if I had to guess without knowledge, the assassination is probably done by Kurdish elements, not by Israelis.
Well, anyway, there's a history of known assassinations on foreign soil by Israel. So if that is your litmus test,
but you know what? But Bob, it goes back to this thing. I mean, if your model of the international community is that it's like Princeton, New Jersey, and just as in Princeton you live by the Kantian categorical imperative because you live in a society of law, and you have your interest in the law is always greater than your interest in any particular outcome, and so you sometimes accept the law when it's disadvantageous to yourself. I think there are parts of the world that conform to that. I think our relationships with the NATO partners and other democracies are governed in that way. But the planet as a whole is not a Kantian realm. In the planet as a whole, in dealing with a country like Iran, we are not in the world of the categorical imperative. There isn't law. There isn't meaningful law. We can't get legal redress against the things Iran does. It's a world of states competing with states. And that is the central. This may be one of the central departures between the conservative and liberal vision of how the world works. Mm-hmm. But I don't worry a lot about being fair to Iran. I worry about upholding American interests in a non-nuclear Iran. And if the Iranians experience that in a way that is not entirely to their liking, they have the option of changing the nature of their regime and joining the community of what we regard as civilized nations, like France, like Germany, like Japan, like Brazil. They can be one of those countries. Until they are outside the realm of law.
This is a fundamental difference between us, because I do think it's important to nurture international law. You said, well, international law doesn't work the way national law within the United States works in terms of everyone complying with it. That's true. And 120 years ago, national law within the United States didn't work that way. There were lynch mobs, there was frontier justice, but we have evolved, and to the benefit of all, the rule of law is more comprehensively respected in the United States. And it is my view that unless we nurture respect for and the further evolution of international law, this whole planet is in trouble. That's a separate argument that we can have. But I think at a minimum, we have to quit egregiously violating international law ourselves by, for example, invading Iraq, which turned out catastrophically, in addition to being a violation of international law. And I think we do. It is in our long-term interest, the long-term interest of the United States, to be mindful of respect for international law and govern our diplomacy with other nations in accordance with that mindfulness. And that's just a difference between you and me about where history is heading. I made this argument in a book called Nonzero, and I stand by it.
I completely agree with that. I completely agree the idea of moving to a world in which more and more of the regulations between more and more states are regulated by law. I totally agree with that. That's how I end that neglected masterpiece I co-wrote with Richard Pearl.
The End of Evil, is that it?
Yes.
How's that working out?
We're making progress. The goal is, it's absolutely true that the relations between the United States and Britain and Germany and Japan and other advanced states, we're all in a network of law together, so dense that we hardly notice it, from international postal conventions to conflict of law rules. The question is, where you departed from what I think about this, is the way we
don't respect international law, David. The United States doesn't. Our allies don't.
Let me finish that sentence. The way you and I depart is, your core idea is the way we get to a world in which countries like Iran follow Britain and Germany is we set a good example, and that will inspire them to join us. And my view is countries choose a regime that elects to comply with the liberal world order. And that is the predicate question. And Iran does not have a regime that has compliance with the liberal world order, and because it doesn't, it's not well positioned to make demands on that liberal world order. So long as it's a terrorist state, carrying from the bombing in Buenos Aires in the early '90s of both the Israeli embassy and the Jewish Community Center, to attacks in Bethesda, Maryland, to attacks in Berlin, where it gunned down in broad daylight Kurdish refugees from Iran in the early 1990s. So the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia.
Some of these are better documented than others. I mean, in terms of Iranian complicity. But again, our allies, our allies, I mean, compare that to the actual record of a Saudi Arabia or an Israel. I just talked about the extraterritorial assassinations by Israel. Compare that to our own. Not all of our drone strikes comply with international law. The invasion of Iraq manifestly did not comply with international law. For that matter, Stuxnet was arguably an act of war, an Israeli-American operation that it wasn't just kind of cyber warfare in the traditional sense. It actually blew stuff up in Iranian laboratories. David, I mean, here's what bothers me is the way you refuse to discuss this stuff. Really, you really do. I mean, do you want to have a serious discussion about America or Israel's compliance with international law? I will reserve an hour any time to do that. You insist on focusing on the nation that most annoys you and pointing to their sins. I contend that their sins in terms of violating international law are no more egregious than ours or a number of our allies in the region.
Okay, Bob, I'm sorry. That argument explains why those of us who are skeptical...
Okay, show me the facts.
What we are concerned about is that proponents of this agreement are more concerned with fairness to Iran than with upholding the United States, the interests of the United States. So when you go into your defense attorney for Iran mode, you think, that's how you say, well, their offenses are no worse than. I said, wow, the last person whose judgment on this matter, because your values there that you're expressing, your standard, the thing you're trying to achieve, is not to advance the interests of the United States, but to subordinate both of the United States and Iran equally to some larger vision that you have. I'm not going down that path. It's the American interest that matters. It's American security that matters. The question, from my point of view, the question of whether you negotiate with Iran or how you deal with them is a purely instrumental question. The goal is not building a world order that disciplines the United States. The goal is making the world safe for America and its allies.
I agree that we should pursue American self-interest. My own view is that American self-interest, profoundly involves the continued evolution of and respect for international law. Our past violations of international law, such as the invasion of Iraq, have ended catastrophically. And I don't have a particular concern for fairness to Iran. I just have a concern for respect for international law and viewing the whole thing as objectively as possible.
Yeah, well, I think countries are entitled to take their own part, and citizens of the country are entitled to take their own part. And we judge this, and the way you think about it, and the way you are proposing that others think about this agreement is pointing us to the wrong answer. The defense of this agreement is to say, the United States achieved something that is good for America. But if you say, well, the United States achieved something that is good for the world system as I imagine it 100 years from now, I think, well, no. In the short term, this is much better than war. And we were being told
by Bibi Netanyahu that if we don't solve this problem of like a 6-week Iranian breakout time, he's going to bomb, basically. That's what we were basically told. Well, we solved the problem. I thought that was the idea. We solved the problem for at least 15 years now. So what's the big objection?
We bought 8 months if they don't cheat.
That's what he wanted us to buy, David. That's what Bibi wanted us to buy.
And what we paid for is to release 100, maybe billion, at least in cash, maybe much more, into Iranian hands while relaxing the arms embargo. And they are going to use that money. This is a country that is at war right now in Yemen and in Syria and in Iraq. They're going to use that money in ways and means that are going to be very destabilizing and dangerous. And the thing that is most amazing to me about this whole thing is we have persuaded ourselves that when they wage war against their enemies, that they are doing us a favor for which we must pay, rather than saying, you know what, yeah, some of your enemies we don't like, some of the ISIS people, we don't like them very much, and we may be willing to help. You make a concession to us, and you'll get our help. Instead, what the most amazing thing about this process is we have paid a price to Iran to solve Iran's security problems for it.
First of all, I mean, you mentioned they're active in Iraq and Syria and Yemen. I think that the extent of Yemeni activity in Yemen is probably exaggerated, but in any event, in all those places, they're spending some of their time, as you suggested, fighting our enemies, the people we say are our enemies. What?
They're not doing us a favor.
Oh, ISIS is not our enemy, David?
ISIS is their enemy much more than it is ours.
I think that's just mistaken. ISIS poses no territorial threat to Iran. It poses a profound threat to Saudi Arabia, which may slowly dawn on Saudi Arabia. It poses a threat to Egypt, much more than Iran. You think ISIS is going to take over Iran? They're not even going to take over Iraq because Iran's not going to let them.
No, the Iranians regard Iraq as their sphere of influence.
Yeah.
They have installed a client regime in Baghdad. They have a client regime in Syria. So it is their clients who are at risk from ISIS. I think we would all prefer to say, yeah, they're pretty nasty actors. We would prefer to see them lose, but Iran must have them lose.
All the actors are nasty. What Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen is nasty. Saudi Arabia did more to destabilize Syria than the Sunni states in sponsoring the initial insurgency. Now, that was a regime that I'm not in favor of. I see the moral case for an insurgency, but if an insurgency winds up just killing hundreds of thousands and displacing millions, it's been a moral catastrophe. And it wasn't Iran that did that. It was our Sunni allies that sponsored that insurgency.
It's Iran that backs the Assad regime. The point to all of this is, and I don't need to enter into, I mean, as you said, the choice between, it's like the Iran-Iraq war, the Middle East, other than Israel, there are very few people you can cheer for in the Middle East. But the question is, who had more at stake? Obviously, Iran. ISIS presents an internal security problem to us. But we do not need to pay Iran $100 billion to deal with ISIS.
We're not paying them that. It's their money. It's their money. We've been freezing it.
Yeah, it's their money. We have the power to stop it. If we can keep it under their hands, that's a good thing.
Okay. Only thing I'd say, the one form of leverage we didn't talk about is the supposed military threat. I think my view on that is, the trouble with threatening it is I don't think it's very threatening to the regime. Nothing would be better for the internal consolidation of power of Khamenei, and his legitimacy is actually under some threat within Iran, I believe. Nothing would be better for him politically than a bombing strike by America or Israel, or ideally both. It wouldn't be an existential threat. It would ensure that they then did go for a bomb, ultimately got one, because the only way to stop a bomb in the long run, if Iran really wants to get one, is to invade and occupy the country, and I'm totally not up for that. So I think that second form of leverage we've talked about, the military form, was not nearly such a strong negotiating lever as some people think.
I'm going to have to leave you here, but so I'll say one sentence and I'll give you the last word. I don't advocate bombing Iran. I think that would be a bad idea. But if I were negotiating with Iran, I would not be briefing the American press on how impossible and futile a military option is. I would be briefing the American press on how credible and effective the military option was, because I'd want the Iranians to think that. And the fact that the Obama administration was so determined to signal the military option is doomed, futile, hopeless, but all options are on the table. Who does that? That's like walking into the car, to use your analogy, I'm walking into the car dealership to buy a Toyota, but first I want everyone to know that Toyota is the only car for me. You're not going to get much of a deal.
Well, thanks for letting me have the last word, but the way I'd use it is just to make the abstract point that there are trade-offs really for both countries between selling the deal domestically or paving the way for the acceptance of the deal on the one hand, and the negotiating signals you're sending on the other. There are intrinsic tensions between those two. There were domestic political reasons that the administration sometimes emphasized the unattractiveness of the military option, and I think that succeeded in some cases in accomplishing the domestic political objectives, but I just think it's an inherent trade-off.
Bob, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
It really is, David, and I appreciate you taking the time, and enjoy the rest of what I presume is a vacation kind of weekend in the wilds of Canada or wherever.
Thank you. It's not so wild. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks, Dave. Bye-bye.